There are some works that aren't here that I would love to come back to when you have a chance. But why don't we just start with the works that are actually here? Maybe pick one or two or three or four that you would like to address.
Okay.
And we can go from there.
All right. Yeah, so I'll talk about the series of paintings I've done for the show. The title of the series is Recontextualizing the Deconsecrated. And that was based on my some research I was doing on the exhibition history of Northwest Coast art. And I was really interested in the way Northwest Coast art has been curated and the way it's been criticized over the last, basically since the Arts and the Raven show. And that was the first show where they called Northwest Coast art. Before that it was ethnography. And so I just wanted to see the way it had changed. And what I discovered was that what happened was there was a lot of big shows in the 60s and 70s, and then in the 90s and recently, but in the 80s there was a lot of big Northwest Coast art shows. And what that did, there was a lot of smaller shows. And what that did was really allow for Native people to become more involved in curating Northwest Coast art because these weren't like major exhibitions. They were able to be more involved, and that really changed the way the artwork was presented. And but the reason that I was really interested in this is that when it went from ethnology to art, what happened was they were taking sacred objects and presenting them as art. So basically what they were doing is colonizing art in the sense that it went from being native culture to art, and that allowed for, basically for like if you look at Northwest Coast art, people can associate that with Canada, with British Columbia, whereas before it was more just ethnography. And that interested me. But the thing is, like when I was doing this research, I had to, I'm not an art historian, I'm not like a culture anthropologist, I'm an artist. And so the way I presented my findings was as artworks, as paintings, and as text. And if you look at the artwork, each one is a diptych. On the right side is text, on the left side is art. And all the text is actually appropriated. So it's based on a curatorial statement and criticism of the show, and all I did was edit it together. And also with the paintings, each painting is based on work that's in each exhibition. It's either directly appropriated or it's based on the curatorial statement from the show.
What was that show?
It's 7 different shows. Like the first painting is the Arts of Raven, and the next one is the Legacy. So each piece is based on a different exhibition over 40 years. And my criteria was it had to be all Northwest Coast art. So there's other major exhibitions of native art that had Northwest Coast art in it, but I didn't include those.
Right. So is there a list of the exhibitions that you're referring to?
Well, it's the titles of the works, so there's a list, yeah, but I don't have it on me. So, but the titles of the work are the exhibitions.
Okay, that's not hard to find.
No.
Okay. Is there a particular work that you have here in the exhibition, like your work, of course, that you want to sort of focus on?
Not so much, and all this work I really enjoy, like Precious, Nostalgic, and Horrifying. That's a series of 10 masks. It's a new work, but it doesn't feel like a new work because I actually put it away for a year before I started it, and I put it away for a year before I finished it. And now just because the subject matter is pretty heavy, and I just didn't want to deal with it for a while. And so that was based on the poem 10 Little Indian Boys. And if you've read that poem, you know that with each verse, one of them dies until the last one commits suicide. And so at the time when I was making the piece, there was a lot of, my Facebook feed was loaded with a lot of stories about Native people who died or who went missing, like just nonstop for a big couple months. And so when I was working on this piece, that sort of was weighing in my mind. So what I did was I rewrote each verse as a haiku based on a person I knew or a story I heard growing up, the Native person who passed away. And so some of these are very personal. And so I finished carving them, and I actually wanted to try something with process, so I decided to do it in iterations. So what I did was I wrote the haikus, and then I did drawings based on the haikus, and then I did carvings based on the drawings. But each iteration didn't have to go directly from the last iteration to each iteration was basically jumping off point, where some of the carvings look exactly like the drawings, but some of them are completely different. That was just my own personal, like I just wanted to try something different in my process, which is something I actually do a lot. I always try to sort of have fun with the process and change things. Like I worked on a mask recently where, you know, with Northwest Swiss Art, like, there's a lot of planning and designing involved. So I decided that I would just start carving something that had no end game, as it were. And I decided that it would take 2 months to do it. And so I did that, and I'll be honest with you, I was completely miserable not having a plan, like just making it up as I go along. And I'm glad I did it though, because it actually helped that sort of, what would you call it? That sort of like, just that process of making it up as I go along, it helped me in other projects. Just the experience of it was really beneficial, but at the moment, in the time, I was doing it, I was miserable. Like I really couldn't stand it, and I really wanted to make a plan, but I decided I would stick with it. I think part of my process is actually just trying to find different processes, and trying to different ways of storytelling.
That feeds into one of these questions that I'd like to come back to later, but I guess the question of the relationship between a material and an idea, I guess there are a number of ways we can approach that. Can I just ask that question? What relationship you can see between material and idea?
Between material, it's a difficult question to answer in the sense that I work with wood. And so my material is wood, and I think everything sort of, I don't want to say that everything flows out of that, but it's really what I do. Obviously I made these paintings, and that choice was, I'm trying to recall why I came to that decision. I think it was because the artworks in the show were all made out of wood. And a lot of these were like sort of material-based shows, but I wanted to do something that was different. I wanted to have like a document, because it was so based on research. I wanted it to be more like a document in the sense of a flat painting and text. And I wanted that diptych to be that way. And that's why I came up with that choice. That's why that materiality was important. But with everything else, I feel like the ideas come out of who I am. You know, what I do is I'm a wood carver, and so that ideas come out of that. But I don't know if I worked with metal, I'm not sure if the ideas would be different or not. I feel like they wouldn't be. I feel like I don't think about materiality that much because I'm a carver and I'm a wood carver. Everything comes up to that. But that being said, if I feel like a project can't be made out of wood, then I have no problem trying to work outside. It is out of my comfort zone, but I feel like I'm always trying to. Because I work so much with wood, I'm always trying to, you know, go out of my comfort zone a little bit all the time. Because, like I said, I enjoy working with wood, and that's what I go to first. But yeah, so no, I don't generally think about materiality all that much. But I think it's just because I'm so comfortable with what I do.
You comment on complex issues such as the repatriation of cultural remains, cultural identity, and the survival and transformation of native culture and its interface with non-Aboriginal cultures. Would that express to some extent the body of ideas that you're addressing when you come to the work?
Yeah, I believe so. Because what I'm doing is I consider myself more like a totem pole carver in the sense that I'm telling stories. Totem poles are about the people who created the totem pole. So it's basically it's a cultural story. And so I feel like I'm still telling cultural stories, but our culture has changed. And I've actually been thinking about this a lot lately because a friend of mine, or one of my former students, tweeted, you know, why do we always have to view native art through like a colonial lens? And I was thinking like, well, it's because we've been viewing ourselves through a colonial lens, and the art reflects that, and it's changing, but it's changing slowly. But we still live in Canada, and that has a huge influence on us. And really, what a lot of us are doing is trying to find our place in that. And it's a struggle, but I find that a lot actually with a lot of Northwest artists where they're trying to see where they fit. Like where does my work fit in? because because it's two different lineages. Because we work, we go to your Eurocentric institutions, and we learn European art history, and we learn a little bit of Asian history, a little bit of African history, and we learn a little bit of Native history, and then some of us go back to our own cultures and we learn Northwest Coast art history, or so on and so forth. And it's two different things, and you're always trying to balance that. I think that's where my work sort of crosses over, is I'm always trying to find that balance. Whereas I think other people do it in other ways. Whereas there's a lot of native artists whose work doesn't look native at all, but they're still trying to balance that as well, I think. I'm just guessing. But then I have friends who are completely working with those coast art traditions, and there's a little bit of balancing that, but it's not. For them, it's more about the market rather than the work they're creating.
The question of stories brings up the question of totem pole, I guess.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a gentleman earlier about totem poles, and how one of the cliches about totem poles is high man and totem pole, or low man and totem pole, where there's a hierarchy of images, and there is, in a sense, but except it's the opposite of what you think. The most important figures on a totem pole are the ones on the bottom, and the least important are the ones on the top. And the reason is because totem poles are carved for people. They aren't like idols to gods. So they basically tell the lineage of the people who had it made, and tell the stories of the people who basically live behind it. And so the most important figures are the ones you can actually, and the reason the ones at the bottom are most important is because the ones you can see as a person, whereas the ones on the top you can't see as well. And we're talking about, and I was talking with a gentleman, he's talking about Italian art, how the things on top are the most important. And so that's because the Italians were creating artwork for the gods, and whereas totem poles are artwork for people, so it makes a big difference. And so what I'm talking about is the totem pole carvers or storytellers. And like I said, the totem poles are about people who lived in that culture at that time. And so what I'm doing is basically doing the same thing. I'm making artwork about people living now. And that's why I talk about post-contact histories like repatriation and Northwest Coast art history and so on and so forth. I feel like because I'm a storyteller, I feel like my practice is more writerly. And so, writers write what they know, and I'm telling stories, I think, feel like from a writer's perspective, rather than from academic perspective, I guess would be the way I would put it. And that's just for me, that's just the way I am able to process the information and put it out. Like I said, I had to stop working on that one for a year because it was too intense. And Phantom Limbs I stopped working on for a couple of weeks because each figure represented a person. So it can be difficult, but you just have to keep going, and what you have to do is you have to just keep going and realize that you get criticism, and you're going to have to take it.
Storytelling has a lot to do with character development.
Yeah.
So there are characters.
Yeah.
And these are known characters.
Some of them are, but I keep that to myself usually.
I want to turn to this piece at the corner here, and talk about Beat Nation.
Okay, so Beat Nation was created by Tammy Willard, and really came out of it was a pretty special project because it came out of basically they started off with just a website, and it all came out of hip hop. And so when I went to the show, what I noticed was it was basically I wasn't in the show, unfortunately, but basically what they were talking about was contemporary Native culture and putting it on display. And I felt like it was a really great piece to include in my series because it was really it was really almost in a sense going back to the place where it's not Native art and culture, it's Native culture, where they were expressing themselves. And it basically felt like it was a good statement. Because a lot of times Northwest Coast art can be seen as static. And I thought it was a great statement in saying that, it's not static, that this is a living culture, it's culture on display. And in a lot of ways, it was Native people showing off their own culture to a non-Native audience, rather than with Arts of the Raven, where it was like an anthropologist showing people other non-natives Native culture in sort of like a curio sort of sense. And so I felt like it was a really exciting exhibition, and I felt it was very vibrant and definitely very contemporary, not in the sense of contemporary art, but I mean contemporary in the sense that it's really the culture now. But yeah, it was, yeah. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to have fun with it because I really enjoyed the exhibition. And I wanted to have fun with it, and not almost feel like criticism is wrong, where sort of tease them a little bit about pop culture references. Tease is probably a better word for what I was trying to do.
When I look around the exhibition, there's a marvelous clarity to your construction of images. They're very clean. Do you think about that yourself?
Yeah, I do actually. It's if anything, I criticize myself often for it not being clean enough. It's because of the tradition I came from. I apprenticed with a master carver, and in Northwest Coast art, there's a lot of emphasis on the finely made objects, and so that's what I tried to bring to my practice, is finely made that tradition of finely made objects, but also mixing with my storytelling and also my work, the stuff we're doing at OCAD. So we're trying to mix it all together, but the finely made object is a part, because I feel like when I'm communicating my ideas, it makes it easier if people have an entry point. And that actually goes back to this series here, where I tried to make finely made objects so people could be like drawn in by the beautiful object, but then realize if you're really looking closer, there's a lot going on there that goes beyond just something pretty.
Look, one of the most natural questions, I guess, one hears, is the question, why did you decide to be an artist? Do you want to respond to that just like that? I think I'd like to split it into two parts. What did you think an artist was when you started off, and how has that evolved?
Well, I mean, I come from a culture, Haida, where art is highly valued. And so when I was young and I showed an inclination towards art, I was very well supported. And so I knew that artists were important to my culture, and so it was very easy for me to think of myself as an artist from a very young age, and I always have thought of myself as an artist. And so there was never a point where I said, I'm an artist. I always just thought of myself as an artist. So it was more of it's more like a way of life for me than a job. And so when I wasn't doing art, I always basically felt like I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. So that part is easy. When did you become an artist? And I just say I was born an artist, basically. And so, and how have I changed how I view an artist? I don't know if it's changed for me. I think it's more coming to a realization as I got older that it just wasn't a job that I aspired to. It was more of who I am.
Is art useful? That's another question that people throw at artists all the time.
Yeah, I don't know. I go back and forth. Is it useful? Yeah, it's useful, but not so much in a. Sometimes not so much in a. What would be a good way to put it? It's useful in the sense that, it sort of breaks up the humdrum of life. I suppose we could all just, go work in a factory and then come home and go to sleep and eat and then wake up the next morning and go to the factory. I suppose it's possible to live like that, but art is basically everything else and in between. And also without artists, who would design things? The whole world is designed. And so it's extremely useful. But again, like I said, we could still just sit on cut off tree trunks and, live in caves and work at the factory, I guess. It's possible. But yeah, it's useful. And it's useful in other ways, obviously, other than just the fact that the whole world is designed by somebody and artists are the ones who design everything. But also in the sense of activism and, storytelling and, stories that people read and stuff like that. Of course, it's extremely useful. I think people lose sight of that when they don't realize how important art is and how the world is basically made up of art.
In the culture that you grew up in, what did you understand the culture understood as art? Or did they see it? Did they use that word?
Well, when I was growing up, unfortunately, I grew up in in a family where we didn't, like my parents didn't speak the language and we didn't really get involved in any sort of cultural activities. So for me, the artwork is basically, I knew I came from a clan system, I knew I was from the Eagle clan, and I knew what that sort of looked like in Haida art and Nishka art, but I didn't really have any understanding of how we used it and how like it was all, like I think native art is almost more like design in a sense that a lot of the objects were useful. Like you painted a bowl or you carved a bowl and used the bowl for soup and boxes and so on and so forth. And so, but I think when I was young I didn't really see that. I think I just saw the imagery. And like it wasn't until later on when there's more of a resurgence of culture, and not only in my family but throughout, where you start to see, you know, what the art was actually for. So I think I grew up in an era where I saw it as art, and I didn't realize I didn't make the connection to culture because I didn't really I had like a post-residential school sort of culture.
This is a difficult question, perhaps, but I'm going to ask it. Do you see, through your work, do you see your work pursuing a core idea that runs right through the practice?
It's a difficult question because I feel like the core, I feel like I'm like, I spend, like whenever I'm designing artist talks or doing interviews, I feel like when I'm doing the research, and research I mean by looking at my own work, that's more when I'm sort of trying to discover the core idea behind my work, and I've sort of come back and forth. I mean, obviously narrative is an important part of my work, and I think, but as far as the core idea, it's difficult because it's difficult because I just do what I do and I enjoy what I'm doing. I'm telling stories, but where I get the stories from, it really just changes. Like sometimes, like I said, like with that, I'm talking about the Haida Repatriation Project, or I'm talking about, you know, the art history of Northwest Coast, or sometimes I'm just, you know, writing stories and making artwork based on the writing. So I guess for right now, I would say the core of my practice goes back to, and I don't even know if it's the core of my practice, but it goes back to when I was doing research about Northwest Coast art, and the original Northwest Coast art, which was objects, so the material representation of intangible rights and privileges. So back in the old days, you would have like a mask, but the mask would be used for storytelling, and so it would be a representation of the intangible, or a totem pole represents the rights and privileges of the family that had it made. So if you can read the totem poles, you can tell which land that the people owned, and which, you know, what trap lines they owned, what you know, where they were allowed to fish, and so on and so forth, and also like cultural practices that they had the right to use, and so on and so forth. And so, like I said, so the totem pole would get old and cut down, but then they'd make a new one, but the new one would be a reaffirmation of the chief's, you know, the chief and his family.
Mm.
And so I think that's where my practice, but that, I'm talking about the process of my practice, I think that's where it comes from. And that's why I enjoy writing stories and creating artwork based on the writing. Is because I'm doing a material representation of the intangible, which is the story I wrote. But that's more about process. As far as the core of my practice, I'm not sure. And I don't really think about it so much. Only when I'm having to do artist talks and do interviews that I actually think about it.
A brief history of Northwest Coast design. Seems an elemental work in your practice. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's definitely, I don't know, it's like, sometimes projects just go, like sometimes you struggle with a piece and you struggle for, you know, what it's going to look like and the idea behind it, and it takes a long time and you work on it. And then sometimes ideas, everything just flows, and that was one of those pieces where I had the idea for the piece, and it was based on an article called "The Process of Decolonization," and that was a leaping off point, and that's when I started thinking about the art history of Northwest Coast and how it mirrored the colonial history of the Northwest Coast, and I think that really struck a chord with people, and that's a piece where the aesthetics really worked with the idea, And so so when people were looking at the piece without even knowing why I did it, I was able to communicate the idea behind it without me telling them exactly what it was about. But I think that's the reason why it's become such an important artwork.
How do you find working with curators?
I've had basically all good experiences, but I can be pretty easygoing. But it's been a mixed bag. I've always been able to I know the way the work needs to be, and so I've always been able to sort of, I don't want to say get my way, because I don't mind working with people, because sometimes people can see things that I can't. So sometimes maybe the way I think something should be, once it's actually put down in practice, maybe I was like, oh, well, maybe, their ideas are actually good. It's like with the show at the Ottawa Gallery. They actually had a really good installation, but there was something I wanted to see. So I asked them if we could redo it, and we did. And so I guess I was a bit difficult. I wish I wasn't, but I really wanted to see the work installed a certain way.
Well, I think there's an important point there that, of course, two people can have very different perspectives on the work, and maybe that leads me to a question I was going to ask later, which was, how do you feel about works that you've made being read through installational practices, perhaps, or simply through time, being read differently than you had first intended?
Oh, it doesn't bother me at all. Actually, sometimes I get annoyed with the fact that with native art we have to be so didactic. Like sometimes people don't want to. There's a lot of different reasons why people don't want to read native art other than exactly the way the artist intends it. But sometimes it bothers me. I wish people would just be willing to enjoy the artwork and not have to be told exactly what they're looking at. So it doesn't bother me. I find it interesting, and sometimes I wish people didn't have to ask me exactly what they're looking at. But I understand, they don't know the history of Northwest Coast art, and they don't know the culture, and they don't want to make assumptions, and they don't want to end up accidentally being racist or something like that. And so I understand why. But yeah, and I've come to terms with it. When I was younger, I used to annoy me. I used to wish people could just look at my art and not have to have me explain it to them. But I've come to terms with it. I understand why now, and so it's fine. It doesn't bother me at all. Especially with Phantom Limbs, a lot of people had a lot of fun with that one, not knowing what it was about. One lady saw them as babies, a whole bunch of a cemetery full of dead babies, and she found it very powerful that way. And so I was actually, it's not, but I mean I'm glad. She was actually glad that I told her it wasn't, but I was happy that she saw it that way, just because she found something different out in it.
Another piece, The Violence of Words.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
that was that came out of my the grad program where I was doing a lot of research into the history of Northwest Coast art, and I was speaking about the basically the colonization of Northwest Coast art, in a sense that it has become an icon for Canadian art in many senses, and Canadian culture. And so what I was talking about, the way they did that basically was through the use of the English language, where they translated all the elements of Northwest Coast art into English words, and therefore made it easier for non-natives to understand it and appropriate it, because they translated the elements, and then they wrote books and they published the books, and anybody around the world could buy these books and really know how to make Northwest Coast art or do a formalist studies of Northwest Coast art. And so, like I said, they basically used the English language to colonize it. And I was trying to show the difference between the visual language and the English language. And so the piece is basically based on a Haida mortuary poll. And in a mortuary poll, you would either have a high-ranking chief or a high-ranking matriarch. And mine was a raven. And so basically, if you knew the visual language and you could go there, you would be able to tell it, okay, that's a mortuary pole, and inside that box there's the remains of a chief or a high-ranking matriarch, and they're from the Raven clan. And so it's very specific to what it is, whereas the words, the raven is dead, is very generic and very sort of not controversial, but it's very like, it's a very broad statement, and it's done with English words and just sort of showing the difference between the two.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that aspect of translation carries, well, as the piece suggests, violence.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was benefits to these English translations because it allowed for native people to work together from different clans, from different cultures.
Mm.
Because there's over 22 indigenous languages in British Columbia, and over 200 dialects, and so Nishkas and Haidas and like Tlinkits and so on and so forth had different words for the elements or different ways of describing the elements of the art, and so really we only had the visual language in common, and so the English language allowed for, especially people after they'd gone to residential schools and learned to speak English, were able to communicate with each other and work with each other because that is common language. So there was benefits, but the price was high, in a sense where now Northwest Coast art is widely appropriated, and if you go to a lot of galleries like in Vancouver, a lot of the art will be done by non-natives, and that's a whole other conversation. I don't really want to get into it, but
I won't go there then.
Yeah.
But of course, it is a familiar conversation about appropriation.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to go there.
Yeah. Of course. I've made my peace with it.
Okay.
Definitely.
I think you said a little bit earlier that well, in the contemporary world, we all live together.
Yeah.
And so, if we're all living together, I'm just going to pose this question to you. We're all living together, and in some respects, we're both aware of and perhaps borrowing from, or even, of course, appropriating from cultures that aren't necessarily those of the artist. Is that not almost, you might say, a core aspect of the contemporary world, since it's such a melange, such a coming together of so many different peoples?
Yeah, I think it comes back to what I was talking about is, I was talking about that question that one of my former students posed about how come we always view native art through a colonial lens.
Mm.
And I think it's just, I mean, yes, you're right, it is, we're all here together, and but I think with native art we're trying to, a lot of times we're past the point of trying to save our culture. Like people, even up to recently, were still saying like, do you feel like you're saving your culture by doing your artwork? Because I think there's like I don't know if it's a myth that the culture was going to die off. Maybe there was, I don't know, but for me it was, even though I didn't grow up in the culture, I always knew who I was, and so I didn't feel like I was ever going to disappear, and so on and so forth. So I feel like we've gone beyond the point of trying to save the culture. Now we're trying to figure out where we are in this world, and so a lot of times we're celebrating our culture, and that goes back to the exhibition history, like the Beat Nation show, where this is a show that was celebrating Indigenous culture, not trying to save it anymore. And I think maybe that was the point of view of maybe the non-native curators. Maybe that's what they were trying to do, trying to save this culture for future generations. I don't know. We can get into that too, about where this sort of save this like long dead culture, whereas Beat Nation was a show celebrating the living culture of the Northwest Coast.
Important distinction.
Yeah, I think so. And so maybe that's my point of view, is that we're struggling to, I don't know, like it's complicated.
Mm.
But yeah, we're all in this together, but I feel like with natives we're trying to, try not to get sucked in to this, try not to lose things.
Into the simple pluralism.
Yeah, but it's and I feel like a lot of the artists I talk to, like we're all just sort of trying to figure that out for ourselves, like where do we fit into this, and because we are influenced by everything from the outside, and it's even like a question for being North America, like in North America where like it's like, no, this isn't a European country, this is a North American country, but for some reason people want it to be a European country. They don't want to acknowledge like the indigeneity of the land and where the history. Like I even heard, like I was talking with someone about hiking, and I was talking to this lady, and she was like, And she was like, yeah. She's like, oh, you should go hiking in Europe. She's like, oh, the mountains are so ancient. And I was like, the mountains are ancient here too, you know? You know, I mean, like, indigenous people have been walking around these mountains forever. Like, it's not like this land just appeared 550 years ago. And I think that goes back to, like, not only struggles as an indigenous artist, but as indigenous people, like, saying, like, people need to recognize that this land and this place has a history far beyond, you know, first contact.
There is a history of Canada, practically speaking, if not rhetorically speaking, of Canada becoming gradually intertwined with the native cultures, and while the dominant culture may have preserved its dominance, nonetheless it has been skewed and changed as a result of that contact itself.
I mean, I think, like I said, I think we hope that that's happening, that we're creating something, you know, different. But I feel like there's a lot of resistance to that. Like, you know, I don't want to mention American politics, but I feel like there's a lot of resistance. People are trying to pull it back again to the olden days when, you know, everything was very, you know, Eurocentric and white. Yeah, I think, yeah, like there's a lot of resistance. Like people are trying to, you know, I understand. They're trying to preserve what they know. And like I said, like there's a lot of like people just want this to be a European country on native land, and
I think that's more an American.
No,
system.
I don't think so.
It was Trevor Nelson Saul who came up with the idea of the Métis Nation, and possibly he's yearning for something that isn't quite there.
Yeah, I feel like he is, but I think it's something that I'm hoping that we'll be able to indigenize this, you know, this country.
There appears to be strong steps in that direction. No?
Yeah, there is strong steps, but like I said, I feel like there's people are trying to pull back now.
Do you feel you have a strategy for that in particular?
I think, well, we talked about this earlier. You were talking about how clean my work is, and I think my strategy is to draw people in through the beauty of what I do, but to hit them over the head with something more serious once they come in. And I don't know if that was a strategy I started off intended on, but I think what happened was I apprenticed with Henry and I learned how to make beautiful objects, and that was just kind of like, I was making these beautiful objects, but then I started, you know, using contemporary meanings behind the intangibles behind my work became as important to me. Whereas before I worked with Henry, the intangibles were more important to me than the aesthetics. And then I learned how to create, I learned how to paint pretty flowers, I should say, in a sense. But the meaning behind it for me became just as important. And so I think that it wasn't a strategy I started off trying to employ. It's a strategy that just happened, where I'm creating these beautiful objects and people enjoy looking at them. Maybe that's what the whole like precious, nostalgic, and horrifying was all about. That strategy that I employ, that I didn't intend on employing, but it just sort of developed, just because of my history, I guess. But it's definitely a strategy now.
Well, it's a strategy that Dave Hickey has suggested is in fact the core to an artwork, any artwork, that you can't have an artwork unless it has quote unquote beauty. In other words, that it somehow moves one. But it won't be an artwork unless there's an argument to which that beauty is directing you. Would you agree with Dave Hickey in that respect?
Yeah. Unintentionally, I guess I agree with that. Because like I'm a studio artist, and sometimes you're just in there working. I was talking with the lady who installed the show for me, and I was like, yeah, I have ideas about installation of the show, but I had it when I was by myself. So it might just be like a ridiculously stupid idea. It's like, sometimes when you're by yourself and you're thinking about these things, and sometimes they're just crazy. And then you tell your friends, they're just like, what? And then you realize, oh yeah, wait, maybe that was just a crazy idea I came up with sitting by myself for too long.
There is the visual artwork, but you also sing or perform.
Yeah.
Use the larger word, you perform. Do you want to talk about that as part of your practice?
Well, I used to be part of a dance group, and that was important for me because at the time I was trying to understand what I was doing as a Northwest Coast artist, and about the fact that these objects used to be, in my mind, used to be used for, they were cultural objects, they weren't art. And so I needed to understand that before I could start making it as artworks. And so I needed to use objects, drums and masks, and perform. And that really helped me sort of connect myself to the culture. I originally started because I wanted to understand the objects I was making, like who the audience, I was trying to understand the audience for the work. And so but then when I joined those different groups, it actually helped me connect myself to the culture. And so it was very important in my own development. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. What was the question?
You're answering it.
Okay.
The question, I guess maybe I should rephrase it because I don't think I was clear. That as a visual artist, of course, we understand you make visual work.
Yeah. Performance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was an aspect of it. I've kind of gone away from, I want to say I've gone away from it, but I made a film in the spring where I was the star and the artwork was the star of the film. There was two, we were the co-stars. Or maybe I was the antagonist and the artwork was the protagonist. But yeah, I performed. And so I want to say that performances, I don't perform so much anymore, but I do. But it goes back to materiality, I guess, in the sense where the idea had to be a film, and but of course there's still a wood carving in it because, like you said, my artwork was the protagonist of my film. But and so yes, I do still perform. I would probably still perform more, except that I developed anxiety, stage fright, basically, where I couldn't perform anymore, to the point where I was, you know, stage fright. I wanted to, felt like throwing up and felt ill, and I couldn't actually perform in front of anybody anymore. But hopefully I'll be able to get back into it, because some of my ideas do tend to go towards that, but I don't do it because I know it'd be very difficult for me.
A while ago, you were talking about, I thought really interesting, you were talking about seeing yourself, of course as an artist, visual artist, but seeing it through the lens perhaps, or understanding it also as a form of writing.
Yeah.
So that you could in fact almost describe yourself as a writer. You want to go back to that?
Yeah, it goes back to when we were talking about the core of my practice, where I was saying I'm creating material representations of intangible rights and privileges, and so because I didn't want to use traditional stories in my work, I started creating narratives, and so when I started creating narratives, I was actually writing them, and then I started creating the material representations of the writing, but then I started creating work from a storytelling perspective, so I felt like I was actually a writer creating these things, and I am a writer creating these things, and so I felt like I started getting away less from, and so basically what happened is my work became more didactic in a sense, and so I started sort of thinking of my practice as that way, and this is basically in the last year and a half where I started thinking of it. It was a shift in the way I perceived what I was doing. Whereas before, more, I think I was creating narratives and I was a storyteller, but I was thinking more in a more contemporary art sort of way. I don't know if it's actually different. I think it's just the way I approach it has changed.
Do you read fiction, or does fiction enter into your practice at all?
It all does. Everything does. Yeah, non-fiction, fiction. It took me a while to actually start reading it again after doing my master's degree, because I felt like I was reading everything all the time, and and so it took me a while to get back into it. I'm only getting back into it probably in the last year. Yeah.
Are there particular writers that you enjoy, or?
Not at the time. I read like Neil Gaiman, but it's nothing that, like, I haven't really gotten back into it. That's one of the unfortunate side effects of doing like a master's degree or a PhD, I think, is that you just get tired of reading things, and it takes a while to get over that trauma. And it is trauma. Like I was telling people, like I cried one time when I was doing my master's degree, and I was like, this isn't even real stress. My life's not in danger, you know, but it's just, you know, it's almost, it's like a traumatic experience. It's taken me a while to get back into it, but I've been making artwork, so I've been keeping my mind busy and my hands busy.
That's hilarious.
But yeah, I used to read a lot. Before that, I read a lot, like nonfiction and fiction. Like I developed a love of art history, and you know, and I would just, you know, surrealism and data. Like I just spent a lot of my time reading all about that stuff, and also like science fiction and horror is a lot of what I would read. And yeah, after the master's degree though, I had to take a break.
Oh, me too.
Art history. Do you read art history for any particular purpose, or just because, of course, it puts you in touch with previous practices?
I read it for pleasure. Like I enjoy, you know, finding the stories. You know, I enjoy reading about the people, like the characters and like their interactions with each other. That's what really I enjoy about it. So if anything, maybe I read it like fiction.
Art history is fiction.
Yeah, maybe that's the way I read it.
Criticism, or the critical press, do you have any thoughts on that yourself in terms of your relationship to it?
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of criticism.
Oh,
Yeah,
lucky you.
I know, lucky me. Like it's been weird. Like I wonder why sometimes. Like I feel like it goes back to like people not wanting to criticize native art. You know, I mean, and I know, and it's weird because I know a few native artists who criticize other native art, but it's always so general and like I felt like I've done some, you know, with my artwork I've done some sort of, what do they call it, velvet glove, like
Oh, yeah.
like criticism of other art movements, and I think it's like that. So I don't think I've had criticism, but I think I've had people who have been sort of like kindly saying like, I don't know if I like what you're doing there, but not from art people. From like with Phantom Limbs, I've had some people say like, you know, this is, you know, how come you're doing this about, you know, the repatriation, people's remains, but it wasn't from art people, it was from like a person. And so I just yeah, you know, I took it fine. Oh, I have been criticized. Yeah, I did a piece for it was hard, but I'm glad it happened, because you know, you can't move on unless you get this criticism. Like, you know, I don't know, it helped me. But how I feel about it, you know, I think it's helpful. Constructive. I think I've come to the age where I can tell the difference between constructive and non-constructive criticism. The constructive criticism hurts more than non-constructive criticism, because it's, you know, non-constructive criticism doesn't mean anything. It's just, you know, silly, you know, people taking a political stance or people maybe not understanding what you're doing. But criticism that's constructive and the person understands what you're doing, yeah, that stuff hurts. But it's helpful, you know.
Does it shift the practice?
It does a little bit, I think, because it's constructive, it's something that you haven't seen, and because you can get caught up, like I said, you can get caught up in your own, you know, bullshit sometimes, and you know, maybe thinking you're better than you are, maybe thinking you're actually conveying an idea and you're not, because you live with it and you can see it and other people can't, and you don't realize that they can't. And so, yeah, sometimes it shifts to practice, and sometimes you just have to say, that's true, but I'm gonna keep going. Or maybe you find another way of saying it.
Do you want to talk about perseverance?
Yeah, well, it goes back to the whole reason of what I do, or as I always say when I talk to students, I always say you have to have a sense of like self-delusion and a sense of grandeur to keep going, because it's really hard, especially once you leave art school and there's no one criticizing you, because the fact is, once you get out there, nobody cares what you're doing, and that's even harder than criticism. When you want to, you know, go get up in the morning and make some art, is the fact that no one gives a shit what you're doing. They don't care if you're making art or not, you know, and that's harder, because if people are criticizing you, that means they care, where they're actually taking notice of what you're doing. And, you know, that, like I said, it hurts you, but you know, a lot of times you keep going. And yeah, it takes a lot of perseverance to be an artist because the world doesn't really care about artists. They don't understand. It goes back to your question about, is art useful? A lot of people don't think it is, and so they think it's like a hobby.
What constitutes authenticity? And yeah, I guess you could use the word originality, but how do you feel about this question of whether a work is authentic, or how does one understand authenticity in the 21st century?
Oh, I think that goes back to your question about the internet and like us knowing what everybody's doing. Is maybe that's what people are trying to do, is figure out, you know, what's authentic. Am I authentic, or am I just like everyone else in the world? Yeah, that's a tough question. Authenticity, like, and native art is all, or Northwest Coast art is all, you know, half of what drives us is figuring out what's authentic. I mean, the whole renaissance of Haida art was based on people saying that, you know, the artwork you've been doing for the last 100 years isn't authentic. You know, the artwork that was being done in the 18th, 19th, and 18th century, that was authentic native art. You know, this what you're doing now isn't. So you have to go back to making art that looks like that. And that was all sort of, and you know, Beat Nation was basically saying that what we're doing is authentic. And not even, no, authentic's the wrong word, but what we're doing is real. It's not, you know, inauthentic, I guess. Yeah, it's a tough question. I think we struggle with it. I struggle with it, I should say. I don't want to speak for anyone else.